And welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
The team at the Research Works podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we live and work. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples, elders past and present, and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast each week, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We recognise their continued connection to this beautiful budja we call home.
So last week on the show, we had the great privilege of starting this amazing conversation with Dr. Sarah Reedman and Associate Professor Leanne Sakzewski. It was so wonderful to speak to them about a study they've been heavily involved in, the HABIT-ILE study, which had so much pearls of wisdom about the principles of neuroplasticity. Now, join us now as we talk more about HABIT-ILE and the main principles, including part task and whole task practice. We'll even cover some great topics about how we apply this in a variety of settings and how to really identify the principles of neuroplasticity in the interventions that we carry out. So I hope you really enjoy part 2 of this conversation. What would you say then if we're talking about part task and whole task practice with relation to someone who's more GMFS level 4 and 5? Like, what are your thoughts on how that applies in that group of children?
Oh, well, I think Leanne has more expertise on this, particularly with the preschool HABIT-ILE, so younger kids, because developmentally, just in terms of developmentally and the expectation, they maybe have less tasks that developmentally they're able to do yet, for example, because all children are growing in their independence at a younger age, but it looks different because of the goals. So, for example, a child who's in GMFCS level 2 is going to have, or likely to have goals that relate to functional mobility and walking independently and using stairs, whereas a child in GMFCS level 4, those goals aren't realistic because they don't match up with what a realistic developmental trajectory looks like for that child. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much, it's not driven by the GMFCS level. Sure. It's driven by what is that next developmental step and what is the important goal for that child. That's what drives how part and whole task practice looks.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I was going to say too, with some of the kids who are more, say, GMFCS 4 level, you've got a lot of, with a lot of those kids, particularly older kids, a lot of deconditioning, a lot of weakness. Mm-hmm. And so there was quite a lot of part task practice, again, dependent on the goal and the child, to help them work towards being successful in a particular task.
Yep. And it was always, though, it sounds like, everything was always relating to something functional in the end. Nothing was ever done in isolation. It was always done within a functional context.
Always.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And our job is to help them to do that, not to leave it to them to work out themselves. Like sounds like that's part of the process. Now, you brought up a little bit before there about, developmentally what they might be doing. I want to talk a little bit about, this probably goes down towards your preschool HABIT-ILE in a way, I suppose, nice segue, but just thinking about the developmental milestones, so much of, I guess, a lot of early intervention, I guess families are often thinking about what's that next thing on my developmental milestones. I want to hit these, I need to be able to sit, then I need to crawl, then I need to stand, and even with hands, I need to be able to go to from a more gross to more fine task, How do we support families when we're starting to talk about this? Because it looks different for children with cerebral palsy. It ultimately does. It's an upper motor neuron disorder. So we have spasticity, we've got weakness. How do we sort of support families through that when it comes from a developmental perspective?
I think sometimes talking with a family through their daily routine. Mm-hmm. Tell me what your day looks like.
Sure.
What are you doing? What's your child doing? Yeah. What would you like them to do next? Yeah. What's the next thing for you that's important? Yeah. I think, we're covering the age range of 2 to 5.
Sure.
And that's huge in terms of that difference in ability across that spectrum. So, for families who have a 2-year-old coming through, sure, it may well be, it's what Sarah was saying, there's actually quite a lot of gross motor related goals, whether it's being able to sit, independently on the floor to be able to play, or whether it's being able to sit or whether it's being able to hold a sippy cup to have a drink. So those goals compared to the 5-year-olds where it may well be being able to sit and do some drawing and stabilise paper or something like that. So they're all very different depending on the children.
Yeah. And again, a very individualised approach. So now we're talking a little bit about preschool HABIT-ILE. Where is that sitting at the moment? And so you've started the study?
So we've started the study. This is a single site study, so we're only running it in Brisbane.
Okay.
It is a waitlist design, randomised control trial as well. We've run about, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, 4 maybe little groups. It's been really tricky, obviously, with COVID. I mean, this has been probably the bane of every researcher's life over the last 2 years. So it's not been without its challenges. So we'll still be doing at least another 3 groups before we try and wrap up. I think that we'll try and finish it up by the end of next year.
Oh, fabulous. That's amazing. So intensity and dosage-wise?
So it's a lot less. It looks very different to the older HABIT-ILE camp. So the kids are coming in for 3 hours a day, and what we are building in, there's a lot more parent involvement and a home program that's really based on the principles of evidence-based home programs of ION and OVAC.
Yes.
And obviously families have different capacities to build that in. What we're finding, particularly with the younger children, the children are getting very tired. We can get them through 3 hours, but they often are sleeping in the afternoon, which I think their parents quite like, perhaps. So it's been a really good learning opportunity. And so it is feasible to do that amount of practice with the children. We certainly feel from our sort of anecdotal observations that they've made some good gains, but we'll wait and see till the results come through.
Yeah. Just talk me through, like, when we talk about the results coming through, it's from all the results coming through into analysing, how long does that process take?
So I would never look at the data until the final outcomes are collected, and that's so that I don't bias myself by seeing that perhaps something is looking really great or not so great. So that would be a very sort of rigid principle in terms of analysis, that you won't look at the data until you get the final results through. So obviously with a waitlist control trial, you can look at it at the timing when all the outcomes for the principal RCT are collected.
But the actual process of it then, I guess, in terms of when it'll hit, when will it hit sort of for the people to actually be able to read the article? What's that timeline there?
It varies, I think, between the end of a research study and when you finish collecting the data. It varies and then there's a number of different reasons why it varies. Sometimes it takes a while to actually check and clean the data, because I think what people might not realise if you're not a researcher, maybe you would assume that as you sort of collect data and you're doing outcome measures, that everything's exactly correct and you're missing nothing and there's no weird values. But in reality, especially we're humans and we make mistakes, and there might be a data point that's way out of range, and so you actually have to go through a process of checking and cleaning the data to make sure that everything's right, and also finding out if there's anything missing. And then you need to extract things, load it up into a statistics package. You've got to actually run all your analyses, which takes time. And then it comes down to writing as well. The scientific writing process, it can take weeks, take months. And then what some people also may not realize is once you've finished a paper, so a manuscript that has all of your results in it, then you have to go through the submission process and you have to submit it to a journal. That takes time for them to process, and then usually it's not accepted on the first round. So that comes back to you, and you've got to change
all the efforts.
Exactly, and you've got to change all these things. So it can be 12 months or more sometimes to get even the first outcomes paper out of an RCT.
Sure.
And one of the other delays that we have, because we want to have, and Sarah talked to this before around bias and minimising bias. We have we tend to have someone blinded to the intervention who is scoring up all our assessments. So they don't know what intervention the child's had, nor do they know the timing of the assessment. So they get a whole lot of videos of assessments that they have to score. And so that actually takes a long time. So for HABIT-ILE, for example, we had a physio scoring all the gross motor function measures. Then we had an OT scoring all the both hands assessment measures. And if you think about 92 children, half of whom have 3 assessment points and half of whom have 4 assessment points, that's a lot of assessments to score. And it takes a long time. So we've just got to the point probably 6 or 7 months after we finish our final camp where all the data is completely scored. So that's kind of gives you a sense of some of the things that do take a little bit of time in terms of getting good quality data.
And I think when you talk about the good quality data there, which I think you've both described beautifully, is why there's such a value in research. I want to sort of talk about, the use of an RCT and why that's important versus someone who might be collecting some evidence from their own practice and sort of watching some of the outcomes that might be happening. There's still value in sort of your own clinical expertise and watching what's happening, but that does sort of classify more as anecdotal evidence. We talk, we briefly said there's anecdotal evidence when we're talking to families. We know that, but we can say that because we know there's great weight in the RCT results, right? So we can talk about that. So what would you say? I mean, we've talked about the whole process of an RCT. It's a long process. It is involved. It involves teams. What would you say to someone who's kind of like, well, I see my practice and, anecdotal is good for me, or testimonials? Like how does that work?
I think it comes down to, again, understanding that those principles, particularly around bias. We know, and that's why an RCT was developed. It's because human nature is so, when we see something, just the observation of something going well, that's so compelling. As human beings, we're so compelled by, excellent results.
True.
And so it's natural. It's actually completely natural to be biased towards, your own practice. If you, especially if you're getting good results or, you perceive them to be good. But what we also know from scientific evidence is that we are biased and we can perceive things to be much more effective than they really are. And we won't know that until we actually have something to anchor and compare it to. Particularly when it's done, as Leanne was talking about, by people who are masked or blinded to, to the status of a group or whether a child is getting an intervention or not. It's really important. The other thing is around, what I remember I didn't talk about was randomization.
Oh, yeah, true.
So really, wow. Randomized control trial.
RCT, here we go.
Randomization. So the role of randomization and why we randomize, in an RCT. So the whole principle of randomization is that we're controlling for those other factors that we know actually increase or decrease the effectiveness of an intervention. So, for example, take 2 children. One child might have, is highly motivated. They might have a lot of resources. So their family has a lot of resources. They maybe have a slightly higher motor function. They've got maybe slightly higher cognitive function. And then you've got a child who has lower motor function, lower cognitive function. Maybe they've got access to less resources. Those 2 children are going to respond completely differently to an intervention. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's natural. It's just the way that these things work. But if we selected only those participants who, or those children who have the highest levels of advantage, and we gave them all the intervention.
Gave them all.
That's right. We would have a massively inflated vision or view of what that the effectiveness of that intervention. So it's really important that we randomly allocate participants to an intervention so that we can control for all of those factors. And it's like smoothing out or averaging the effect of the intervention. So you kind of know, okay, well, this is what it's like on average across the average participant. And it means that we're not, you don't have a sample bias. So we're not artificially inflating the results, which can happen in non-randomized trials.
Yeah, sure. I think that's such a great explanation. Leanne, what would you say then if we're talking about these average results, what would you say about the people who are performing way above that or way down the lower end of that? Like, the applicability, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think some of the biggest studies have been able to kind of try and tease out the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. And again, I sort of touched on this before about having a bigger sample where you can start to try and tease out, you might look at, for example, the gross motor function measure. You might think, well, what's a minimal clinically important change? And let's look at all the kids who've had that change. Yeah. And let's look at their characteristics and compare them to those children who haven't had that degree of change. And to start to try and tease out who it is who might really be amenable to this intervention, because we know that all the children in one of our studies, they never respond in exactly the same way. Mm-hmm. And you will have those ones who are, I say in quotation marks, your best responders.
Yes.
And they're the ones whose videos we'll see presented at those conference papers and the like. And then there'll be children who have had a far more modest effect. So I think it is incumbent on us to try and tease out what are the characteristics of the child and the intervention and some of these other sort of environmental factors potentially that would lead to a better result or not. Yep. I think it's important for us to try and unravel that question, and I don't think we have in any of the current evidence per se really been able to answer that question.
Sure. I guess from here now, I'm really curious about your thoughts on, we spoke a lot about part task and whole task, evaluating evidence and how we would apply that. What would you say to a newer graduate therapist, someone new to the field, or to a parent who's looking online? We know there's a big information seeking phase, and trying to find information. They might not have access to people like us to be able to talk about these things sometimes as well. So they're just looking for information. How can they discern an intervention that's more likely to actually fit in line with neuroplasticity and all the principles you talked about, and one that's probably levering off it without any real substance to it, but using all the right words? How can we tell the difference? Because it must be so hard if this is not your area of expertise. What would your advice be?
I think it is really hard. I think that's a lot to put on a family 100%. or even a therapist, because learning how to do clinical trials and learning how to be a scientist takes such a long time.
Yes.
And so we even don't have that expectation on ourselves to be able to evaluate, really tricky evidence. So, I would say it's hard, but if there are a couple of things that you could look for, number one, just being able to see if any evidence is cited. So you're looking online. Is there a research study that is cited against this evidence to demonstrate its effectiveness? And particularly if it's a randomized controlled trial. So it's or a systematic review. So that's sort of higher levels of evidence. Another thing would be around actually knowing what those principles of motor learning and principles of neuroplasticity are. They might seem a bit far removed, but you can learn them. You can understand what they are, and then you can use those to compare against the features of that intervention. So for example, is it at a high enough dose? So are you actually getting enough of the therapy?
Yes.
Is the practice intense enough?
Yeah.
Is it well connected to your child's goals and what your child wants to achieve?
Yeah.
So, for example, if their goals are around mobility and walking, that's what they need to practice. They need to be doing mobility and walking, and probably the other things as well. Just making sure that the therapist or the provider answers your questions honestly, and if you do have questions, that they can connect the answers back to what the evidence says. I think that's really critical.
Leanne, any thoughts on that as well?
I think specifically in the CP field, you're right. You could go on the internet and there's so much information, but the thing to remember, it's not curated. It's just it's a free for all. So within specifically the CP world and the evidence, in the last sort of 5 years now, we have 3 clinical practice guidelines that have been developed. And that is curated evidence that has been looked at, and very robust methods applied to including or not including a raft of evidence.
Yeah.
So I think there's obviously the clinical practice guidelines for early diagnosis and early intervention, and then the recent ones that we've done on interventions for interventions to improve physical functioning.
Yeah.
And there are, what we have developed with that particular guideline are very specific information leaflets designed for families that give them an overarching overview of the key principles that should be included in an evidence-based intervention.
Yeah.
And I think, having gone through doing systematic reviews and clinical practice guidelines, they are an enormous undertaking, an enormous amount of work.
Yes.
But they do provide for families and clinicians an overarching summary of the best available evidence that is currently out there.
Yeah, yeah. And I know that you would have gone through a lot of this. I mean, I look at all the systematic reviews that I've read that you've been involved with. You've looked at a broad range now. I'm curious about some areas. I mean, social media is a big thing, and that becomes an information hub for a lot of people as well. They share stories. It's really powerful. It's not all bad. There's a lot of positives about that as well, right? But, you do see videos of kids doing therapy, and it's hard to understand where it all sits sometimes. And I'm curious from a systematic review perspective, have you seen in the literature some of the things that we see in social media? So I think one of them is called dynamic movement intervention, or DMI. Have you seen that in any of the literature?
So no, that wasn't included in the functional therapy guidelines because we only included the highest level of evidence, and that is randomized control trials, which we've spent nearly all this time talking about.
Yeah,
so it means that we could not find any randomized control trials of that particular intervention.
Yeah, sure. And I guess that's very similar with the predecessor to that one. I think that one's I don't ever know how to say it.
CME, quasi-medetic exercise.
Yeah, I think I've only ever seen case studies on that one as well. Have you seen
that's
anything
right.
else on that one?
No, so it's the same. So there's no randomized controlled trials that we can draw upon. Like, we can't make a scientific determination of whether something's effective or not effective unless we have scientific evidence to support it. So when you've got like a new or emerging therapy that isn't supported by evidence, I think what you are looking for is that eventually there are studies, so that you are looking for, well, in the next couple of years, we really do need to have we really should be seeing evidence to support that.
Yeah, 100%. Look, I'm genuinely surprised that over the past 50 years of CME being around, and of course DMI is based primarily on this therapy, so much so that CME therapists get advanced standing when getting licensed for DMI. Yet they still stand on their anecdotal evidence or, the few case studies that have happened in CME rather than being properly critiqued and tested in a rigorous scientific form. And if they haven't completed any of the research, the level of RCT in half a century, that really tells us where it's at from a scientific perspective, doesn't it?
You also need to be collecting lots of data as well. So if your child is having an emerging therapy or one for which there are no studies to support it, carefully collecting outcome data at baseline and after you've had an intervention so that you can see what the personal effect is on your child. Because without that, then we really don't know, is it worth the time? Is it worth the money? And that's what you want to know. If that's, as a parent, that's really what you want to know.
And I think that's such a great way to be able to see it and to be able to understand it and talk about it with families, because it is a collaborative process when we're talking to families and they're just seeking information, aren't they? And I think that's the key. One of the things I just want to finally touch on now, which seems to be a theme in a lot of what we're talking about, is salience. I want to go back to that. Like, if it's important and meaningful for the person and the child, what does that look like for you in a therapy session? How can we tell?
I think that for me, it comes down, I guess this is my background in self-determination theory. I'd say, you've got those key elements of motivation and engagement. You've got relatedness. So the child is sort of showing the signs that they're feeling like a part of things and that they're connected to you as a therapist, they're connected to their family members and their friends that they're participating with, that they feel kind of they feel that sense of self-efficacy or confidence.
Yes.
So we're using a just right challenge
Yes.
to elicit that sense of mastery and self-efficacy and confidence. And also that they're in control in a way in a situation. So a child is feeling like they're in the driver's seat.
Yeah.
So things are tailored exactly to them, that they're interested in what's happening, that it's, the things that they like and find fun are integrated into the therapy session, and that those things come together. And so, autonomy, competence and relatedness in self-determination theory to create that sense of intrinsic motivation and fun. And ideally as well, that means the child is happy that they're having a good time, that they're well regulated, that they're not distressed. Those things tell me that this is a really good therapy session and that this is highly salient and highly motivating.
Yeah, I love that. So I guess the contrast to that then, because I think those are very clear signs, you kind of touched on it there a little bit as well in terms of distress. So what does a therapy session look like if it's not hitting the mark for the child and it's not salient? What does that look like?
Yeah. Kids who are crying, just in an obvious state of physiological or psychological distress. So looking for all those signs, crying, having even physiological distress, so having the red face and or that kind of thing, being distracted, not engaging with instructions or engaging with the activity, asking for the therapy session to stop, just those things that we
need to listen to those cues.
Absolutely, and like we as therapists need to, if the child isn't actively engaging in what we're doing, what is happening, we know that they're not learning because learning is connected to salience. Learning is connected to motivation. Learning is connected to our state of regulation. So you need to be well regulated to learn. And I think to make the best use of our time in a therapy session, we need to make sure that children are learning. And so if something's not right, that's actually incumbent upon us to realize that and change the therapy situation immediately to rectify that, re-engage the child, get them back into that state of regulation and make sure they're having fun. That's the whole idea. Therapy should be so much fun. Therapy should be engaging. We want kids to come back and have a great time.
And if I sort of reflect, because we videotaped all of our HABIT-ILE sessions,
great.
And when you said, what does it look like? I was thinking, it looks like kids are really focused because they're attending and they're in the moment and they're doing something that obviously, as Sarah said, is motivating. They usually have a smile on their face or they could be laughing or they could be chatting with their therapist. But it's that whole I was going to say it's the vibe, of just being engaged and happy.
And the time, I remember, the expert Jenny Ziviani used to talk about this a lot. That flow state.
Oh, the flow state.
When the time just evaporates because
I love that.
The flow state. So and we as adults know what that's like. If you're engaged in a task and the time just sort of disappears, but you could have spent hours doing something. That's what it means to be engaged in something when you're in a flow state. And so that's what you're aiming for in a therapy session.
And I was thinking you were saying, when they're red, but then I was thinking of some of the kids who had these very challenging gross motor goals, and they were so focused and they were working and they were sweating because they were working hard.
That's the good type of red.
That's the good kind of red.
That's right. That's like the exercise. That's right.
When you get red.
If you're exercising, obviously you're going to get flushed and sweaty. But
But I think too, part of that is understanding what the children like to do, what are their interest areas and how can you build that in to their therapy session. I always remember that one lovely session with a girl we were working with who was a fanatic of Harry Potter. Well, all of her goals were, she had a goal of stirring for cooking. Well, she was making up potions and
love it.
And everything was built into this interest area and she was just so focused and engaged and I think too, the other thing you see when they really like it, they want to come back and they want to see you and they look forward to it.
I think those are important factors. We talk about things being fun and enjoyable. They're not just so it makes us feel good. It's actually important for learning. And I guess, if they are distressed and they're really upset about it, about therapy, we shouldn't be pressing on. We should be trying to figure out why and whether we can fix it as well. I think that's the important part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, I guess it almost seems obvious. If a child is distressed, something about that situation has to change.
Yes.
And it's incumbent upon us to figure out, you know, and problem solve around what that is and why that's happening. And sometimes you need a multidisciplinary approach to that, because you might not know what's happening. The child, especially if they've got complex needs in communication, might not be able to tell you why something is distressing. So you may need to bring in other people to support you. But certainly,
that's okay.
absolutely, that's okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely okay. Yeah.
Oh, look, I've absolutely loved today. I feel like I have learnt so much, and I hope all the listeners will have as well. I feel like we could just finish off with one last question for each of you. Leanne, I know you've helped me with this before, and I love your pearls of wisdom. You're such a talented researcher, and I just feel so privileged to do a research study with you because I'm learning so much already. So what would your advice be to someone who's, or even to yourself, you know, if you were to do this again and start the research journey, what's the one bit of advice you'd give yourself?
Well, I'm going to take a step back in time a little bit as a clinician, because I worked clinically for a long time before I went into research. And, you know, when you're working clinically, you always come across problems and you think, well, what should I do here? And you go searching for some evidence and there isn't any. What do you do? And I think if I look back, you know, at that time I'm thinking, oh, if only someone would research this. But now I think, actually, I have the research skills. I could research that question. But so I think, you know, what are the questions we should be researching? And I think I have a very good partnership with our clinical colleagues, and a lot of the research ideas that I've done have actually come from clinical questions. So I think going forward for the betterment of both our professions in physio and OT, building partnerships between clinicians and researchers is just going to be the key to our professions and our professional practice. And I think, you know, if I think, you know, as I said, go back in many years, I would have thought research was a very scary enterprise. But if I had someone I could go to and say, I have got this idea, what do you reckon? I had support. I would have been happy to really try and learn something about research at that point because, as I said, when you're working in clinical practice, you come across questions every single day.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's really good advice. Thank you for that. Sarah, what about you? What kind of advice would you give yourself?
Oh, that's really tough. I mean, first of all, I would echo what Leanne said and add to that as well. I think we probably need to resource some of this a little bit better, and that I've learned a little bit about this in my new role at CPA in implementation and research translation. That doesn't happen on its own. It sort of doesn't, you know. Just because a paper magically exists, that doesn't filter down into our clinical practice. So we need to invest in implementation. But what would I tell myself going into research? I think I would probably tell myself that, you know, it's going to be a long journey. You know, the learning process takes a long time and you've got to give yourself grace and you've got to be up for the vulnerability as well, putting yourself through something it's quite tough and by the very nature of it, you're stretching yourself into an area that, you know, you're not comfortable in, right? So you've got to be vulnerable. But also that it is incredibly rewarding and that it will actually transform your clinical practice because once you understand how that evidence generation process works, it really changes how you think as a clinician and what you're kind of willing to do and how you actually even search for evidence to support what you're doing. I think it's really transformative in a good way. And I think many more clinicians should have the benefit and the opportunity of being involved in research at whatever level. You know, it could even just be that clinicians are providing their clinical expertise to a research study, or they could be involved in delivering an intervention or delivering an assessment for a research study. Having more clinicians with the time to participate in research is a good thing, getting them that exposure and building that confidence and capability.
Oh, that's such a great answer. And I knew that both of you guys would have really beautiful, comprehensive answers to this. But it's also great advice, where to start, and it's not beyond your reach. So I can't thank you guys enough for, one, coming to Perth. Thanks for coming to WA. We did open the borders especially for you guys.
We love it.
Thank you for being here. Look, there was so much more we could have talked about. I feel like we could talk for more, but we do have things to do. So we better head off and do those things. But thank you so much for coming and for being part of the podcast.
Thank you, Dana.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. That was such a good opportunity.
Thank you. Oh, we had such a great conversation. So to all of our listeners, remember, you can have a hold of the run sheet notes, the things that we talked about today on our website, researchworks.net. Remember, there's a CPD form there that you can fill out as well if you want to keep this as a part of a record of your PD requirements. So for now, we're going to say thank you and goodbye, and we look forward to talking to you all again next time. Bye.